Have you ever been to a sleepaway camp? When I was like 11 years old, my parents sent me away to Arrowhead Bible Camp. And while I resent the indoctrination, it's still one of the few trips I've taken over my lifetime that I think about pretty much every day. On one hand, it was absolutely gorgeous. I mean, we were surrounded by nature. And as a kid who grew up in a small little suburb, it felt really great to be surrounded by trees and, water and animals and so many other things, because the closest I ever got to being around nature is the creek down the street. But one of the things that also sticks into my mind about camp was how much I dreaded the lodging situation. I mean, this was a Christian camp where it was co-ed, but the girls were here and the boys were there. And I might have been a very well-behaved Christian child back then, but I was also a very obviously queer child. And that led to me getting bullied quite a bit. And so I really dreaded being in these situations where I had to be away from home, away from my family, away from my friends for such a long period of time, living with boys because that's who I had to live with at the time, and just how sort of isolating that felt for me. So I guess camp sort of conjures these sort of positive and negative feelings for me. And I guess you could say the character Angela in this week's film may have had some very similar feelings, though we both reacted to these feelings quite differently. Sleepaway Camp is a 1983 slasher film written and directed by Robert Hiltzik. At the start of the film, a man named John Baker takes his two children, Angela and Peter, to a lake near Camp Arawak. In a freak accident, John, along with one of his children, is killed by a motorboat that runs them over as they're in the water. 8 years later, we discover that one of the children, Angela, has survived. She's gone to live with her Aunt Martha Thomas and her cousin Ricky. One day, Aunt Martha decides to send Angela and Ricky to Camp Arawak, the same exact camp right next to the lake where the accident happened.
Hey, this is my cousin Angela. How you doing? She's kind of shy, I guess. First time away from home and all.
Angela is still clearly very traumatized by the accident. She's very peculiar, never swimming or showering in front of other girls. Not to mention, she hasn't spoken much since the accident, and this starts to really annoy other campgoers, especially Judy, the newly blossomed girl on camp who all of the boys are drooling over.
What are you looking at?
She really only starts speaking after meeting Ricky's friend Paul, who asks her about the accident and apologizes for it happening. The two start to develop somewhat of a romantic relationship. As Angela and Ricky spend time at the camp, there's a series of gruesome murders that occur. Mel, the owner of the camp, tries his best to keep the murders hush-hush, but eventually they start spinning out of control to the point where he even ends up being a victim of this mysterious killer. Now, before Mel was murdered, he started to put together that pretty much every single person who was murdered had mistreated Angela in some way. And because Ricky is so overly protective of his cousin, he started to suspect that Ricky may be the killer. As Paul and Angela's relationship develops, Paul keeps pushing for them to be intimate, and Angela ultimately ends up rejecting him. Once that happens, he ends up running to Judy, who is all too happy to take the opportunity to hurt Angela's feelings. Angela actually ends up catching Judy and Paul hooking up, and she runs away.
Angela! Angela!
Hey, where are you going?
You're a real scumbag, Judy. You know that?
Fuck you, Ricky.
The next day, Paul apologizes to her, and Angela seemingly expresses an interest of being intimate with him and tells him to meet her at a certain part of the camp. Camp counselors would ultimately discover Angela at that location in the water, completely naked, and when she's naked, it's revealed that Angela is actually a boy. Apparently, at the start of the film, Angela was actually the child that passed away, leaving Peter behind. And when Aunt Martha adopted Peter, she ended up raising him as a little girl instead, giving him the name of his deceased sister. And the film ends on a very disturbing still image of a completely naked Angela holding Paul's severed head with male genitalia in full view. And she lets out this really loud, scary, animalistic scream. Yep, and that's how it ends. Okay, so really quick side story about this movie before I get into all of the analysis and conversation. The first time I ever saw this movie, I was kind of in this relationship with this guy who had never been with a transgender woman, and our entire relationship at the time, especially because it was like in the middle of like quarantine and we were being like quarantine buddies, was basically us watching horror movies and having sex. And he was really excited to show me this film. And I don't think at the time it really clicked to me how offensive the film was. I mean, maybe it's because the D was good and so was that indica, but I definitely didn't understand like just how offensive this movie was at the time and how odd it was for him specifically to show it to me. And when I say that it's offensive, I mean, I'm not personally like offended. We'll get into this, but I think that there's a lot of things to enjoy about this film. So I'm not like a person who's like, oh my God, I'm so offended or whatever. But at its core, the punchline of this film is that the murderer is a murderer because they're transgender. And that is a very, very overdone trope. And yeah, I can't believe that I watched this movie with this guy and still thought he was like cute or whatever. But you know, I was dickmatized. It happens to the best of us. I think this is definitely a film that is a different experience once you have the information at the very, very end of the film. And I think that there's a lot of stuff that's recontextualized once you understand that Angela is actually Peter, who was forced to live the life of a young girl. Angela is a very quiet and passive character through most of the film, which means that she is often sitting there and observing everyone around her. And one of the interesting things that I noticed when I was watching this film is that it had a lot of themes about gender. When they get to camp, the first time that Ricky runs into Paul, they have a conversation about Judy's breast development and how exciting it is to them.
Hey, Rick, wait till you get a load of Judy. Man, oh man.
Oh, yeah?
And Judy herself is sort of this embodiment of a hyper-feminine ideal for a teenage girl of that era. Fun fact, Robert Hiltzik actually wanted for her character to be a blonde, but they ended up really liking the actress who they picked for Judy a lot more, even though she had a similar hairstyle to Angela. Judy is pretty, she's popular, and she's markedly more mature than the other girls around her, even having somewhat of a friendly relationship with the adult counselors. Throughout the film, Judy spends a lot of time grooming herself and luxuriating, and there's a lot of scenes where Angela is just kind of staring at her. And knowing what you know now, you have to think what exactly is going through her mind. Is she admiring her? Is she jealous of her beauty? Is she attracted to her? There's so many layers to what could be going through her head when she's sitting there just blankly staring at the girl who is in many ways the most overt example of hyperfemininity on camp. Either way, she observes the very specific ways in which Judy cultivates her gender, and one of those ways seems to be hooking up with boys. When Angela hangs out with Ricky, she sees how the boys interact with each other, often bullying each other for not being masculine enough. There's this scene where all of the boys play baseball and they're constantly one-upping each other about their masculinity. And it seems to be this sort of tug-of-war between the two groups over which group is most masculine. And they're defining this by who ends up ultimately winning the game.
What are you gonna do with your big paycheck?
I don't know. Maybe I'll get a Corvette or something. How about you?
I think I'll take a cruise.
Hey, Gene, how about some real competition next time?
Yeah, maybe the girls want a game.
And part of that tug-of-war of masculinity is, of course, hooking up with girls. Paul is in so many ways an outcast among the boys because he's one of the few boys who hasn't hooked up with a girl. And you have to sort of wonder if Paul would even have an interest in knowing Angela if that wasn't why he was interested in connecting with her. And you sort of feel that Angela pieces this together when she ultimately sees Paul hook up with Judy, because it's clear that that's what he was after. after, and Paul was frustrated with the fact that Angela wasn't going to give it to him. Through most of the film, Angela is just sort of sitting there quietly, very obviously not quite identifying with either one of these groups. Now, it's worth noting that Sleepaway Camp is actually a series, and in the second installment of the series, Angela is indeed confirmed to be a transgender woman, but Robert Hiltzik, who didn't work on the films beyond the first film, definitely seems to take a certain stance. One of the big things you notice in this film is that a lot of the men are very scantily clad. And at first I thought that this was just an artifact of the time, maybe this is just how people dressed in the 80s. But apparently Robert Hiltzik wanted to paint these images of half-naked men, mostly to sort of allude to the end of the movie. See, canonically, Angela's father is actually a gay man. At the very, very start of the film, there is another man who is also at the lake, and I didn't realize it, but that was actually his partner, Lenny. When Angela is about to get intimate with Paul, she has a flashback where she sees Lenny and John in bed with each other. And it's that flashback that ultimately makes her run away. In a 2011 interview, Hiltzik said, "Well, there's no question it's a gender issue. There are definitely gender conflicts going on with Angela. Starting at an early age, she was exposed to multiple sexualities. Her father was gay. Then she was thrust into a gender transformation, whether she wanted to or not." So it's clear that from Hiltzik's perspective, Angela was firstly traumatized by seeing a gay relationship, then secondly traumatized by the death of her gay father, and thirdly traumatized by Aunt Martha forcing her to live a life as a girl. And all of this kind of paints a picture that Hiltzik might not be a huge fan of gay parents and probably doesn't support gender-affirming care for minors. At the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind that this film came out in 1983, where we were having far fewer conversations about both of those topics. In the 80s, the film wasn't very well received. Several people considered the film to be kind of boring and the twist to be kind of underwhelming. Rick Lyman of the Philadelphia Inquirer said, "I've had more thrills untangling paper clips. The people behind Sleepaway Camp seem to think that the climax is a real shocker, a big surprise. If you've been living in Sri Lanka for the past 20 years without television or newspapers, the ending might cause your eyebrow to raise about 1/10 of an inch. No more." A review in the Morning Call said that it was simply horrible, like being forced to watch somebody's home movies. No stars. And the LA Times said that it was unpleasant, poorly made, and derivative. Felissa Rose, who plays Angela in the film, actually had quite a bit of fallout for playing this role. She was relentlessly bullied, and she actually had a really hard time getting roles because people thought that she was actually transgender. When Rose speaks about the character Angela, she speaks about her as though she is a transgender girl as opposed to a boy who was forced to live the life of one. But it's worth noting again that Robert Hiltzik only worked on the first Sleepaway Camp before signing away his rights to other companies who produced the sequels. So there's a lot of debate about whether or not her character in the first one can really be compared to the character in the second one. And perhaps because of that, there are a lot of conflicting feelings amongst transgender horror fans about the film. To me, the twist was very plainly transphobic. You're supposed to look at her body and the fact that she's transgender and come to the conclusion that because she's transgender, she committed these violent acts. And to me, that's just very plainly transphobic. As an audience member, you're supposed to look back at all of her interactions with other characters and sort of see them through a different light, especially her relationship with Paul. There is, in fact, a idea amongst people who are fans of this film that the reason why Angela killed Paul was that Paul wasn't accepting of her as a transgender girl. You're also supposed to look back at her time in the girls' cabins and sort of see her looking at the other girls as sort of perverse. In so many ways, Sleepaway Camp's big twist is truly about the absolute terror that many cis people feel when it comes to transgender people's bodies. Because without that big twist, This is really just a film about a girl who kills a bunch of bullies and pedophiles. In many ways, Angela is just a revenge killer who killed people who demonstrably harmed her and her cousin Ricky. Oh, when I was rewatching it, I definitely was cheering her on, knowing that she was the murderer, especially after she kills the pedophile cook. And you know, when you think about Angela as like a young trans girl standing up against her bullies, she kind of becomes like a trans icon, you know? Alice Collins wrote an article on the horror movie website Bloody Disgusting about how much she appreciated how Felissa Rose played the character Angela, saying, "One of the most interesting and accurate parts of the entire film is Felissa Rose's masterful portrayal of a young trans girl. Angela rarely talks and she seems very uncomfortable at all times. For the majority of the early part of the film, she has her hands down hanging, covering her genitals, and you can see her trying to disappear and hope that no one notices her. She barely says a word. I cannot begin to tell you how accurate this is to the lived experiences of so many trans women I know, myself included. I've totally been like that in the past. You feel this never-ending discomfort that you can't even tell where it stems from. There's no words to describe how you feel. You just feel wrong. You stop talking. You try to hide and cocoon until you feel like you've transitioned enough to go back out like a butterfly into society." Felissa Rose was just 13 years old when she played Angela, and she plays a really, really good, dejected trans girl who doesn't feel connected to any of the things around her. Collins also mentions in the same article that for 1983, this was some of the better representation for transgender women at the time. On the other hand, transgender film critic Willow McKay had this to say about the film's big reveal. "Sleepaway Camp is a curtain-yanking picture with a reveal that works only to make a woman with a penis a vessel for horror. It's a trap narrative rechristened in the structure of the slasher genre, where instead of a lover being revealed as a deceiver, a murderer is exposed as a transgender woman. This harmful, false narrative furthers the notion that we are not who we say we are, and that we are more prone to committing violence than we are to being victims of it ourselves." The film asks its viewers to build sympathy towards Angela, who has had a difficult life leading up to summer at camp, before transforming her into a monster in the final few frames. By making Angela a whipping post for constant teasing, she becomes the central character. In horror movie tropes, she is set up to be the final girl, someone to rally around when she is eventually confronted with the incarnation of evil. However, Hiltzik subverts this idea by making Angela not the victim, but the killer. And in what the movie suggests is a much worse transgression, not a girl, but a boy. Apparently, when Hiltzik sat down to write this film, he had the very beginning and the very end figured out. And he wanted to sort of fill those spaces in between with foreshadowing. This is what he had to say about that in a 2014 interview with Den of Geek. "I wanted a good beginning to grab the audience right away and then hold on to them. Then I wanted a shocking ending or a twist that they would talk about when they walked out of the movie theater. And then I filled the movie from that point on. I thought that was something that no one had really seen before and would really shock the system of the audience. The psychosexual angle came about because once I picked that ending, I thought I had to foreshadow it. Otherwise, I'm cheating the audience. So there had to be that issue. Even if it's just below the surface, it had to be presented." While Sleepaway Camp may be one of the more infamous films where the murderer turns out to be transgender, it's definitely not the first. In fact, it is actually quite the trope. 3 years before Sleepaway Camp, the film Dressed to Kill was released, and a central part of that story is that the murderer turns out to be transgender. In Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 proto-slasher film Psycho, Norman Bates retreats into the persona of his dead mother and cross-dresses while murdering his victims. In Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill murders several women in order to create a suit from various women's bodies that he will wear and ultimately feminize himself in. And before his character is fully revealed, some of the most upsetting scenes of him are scenes of him applying makeup and approximating femininity. Now, while you can't say all of these characters are transgender women in the classic sense, all of these characters share the commonality where them being somewhere on the trans spectrum is one of the things that is presented as a motivation for why they are murderers. And that's definitely the inference that you get from Sleepaway Camp. It's clear to me that while you could maybe blur your vision and see the queer themes in Sleepaway Camp, it's definitely a film that has a pretty transphobic premise. But you know, I still think it's a pretty fun slasher film for what it's worth. One of the coolest things about Sleepaway Camp is that it had a really modest budget of $350,000 and it ended up making $10 million. It was actually pretty successful in the box office, beating out Amityville 3D and Yentl. It would end up having 4 sequels and would ultimately become a cult classic. Robert Hiltzik actually quit the film industry after the first movie and became an attorney in New York City, where he currently lives. And those are my thoughts about Sleepaway Camp. When I was talking about this with one of my friends, they were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you are giving this much consideration to this film. I know that a lot of people have a very visceral reaction to this film and don't like it, right? But I wanted to give it a view. I asked you guys which film I should review for Halloween, and this was the one that kept coming up. So I wanted to talk about it and share my thoughts about it. I don't think I have a desire to watch this ever again, but I will say that it was a good time. I definitely will say that it was certainly an experience to have completely sober and without a cute guy and a blunt, but it was an experience nonetheless. Maybe we'll do this again next year. I'm not going to watch the sequels though. That's just not going to happen. I have no desire. But anyway, happy Halloween to everybody out there. I hope you guys enjoy your Halloween and stay safe. And I will talk to you guys next time. I want you to always remember and never forget that you are beautiful and you are loved. Bye.